Everyone in the cafe laughed when a wealthy bully shoved a quiet single man straight into an elegant woman sitting alone by the window. Coffee spilled across her expensive suit, and the bully smirked, expecting security to throw the man out. Instead, the woman slowly stood, looked at the embarrassed stranger, then turned toward the bully with an icy smile. "Do you have any idea who you just humiliated?" she asked. Seconds later, every employee, every customer, and even the cafe manager froze as they realized the quiet single dad wasn't just another customer. And neither was the woman he had accidentally bumped into. The morning had started the way all of Marcus Hale's mornings started, quietly, without drama, without expectation. He was 38 years old and had learned long ago that the world moved loudest for people who demanded attention, and he had no interest in demanding anything. He rose before sunrise, brewed a single cup of coffee in the apartment that still felt too large for one person, and dressed without looking in the mirror for longer than necessary. His clothes were clean but old, a gray Henley, worn dark jeans, boots that had walked more miles than most men twice his age. He carried a paperback tucked under his arm, a mechanical pencil behind his ear, and the kind of unhurried gait that belonged either to a man with nowhere to be or to a man so certain of where he was going that he saw no reason to rush. Marcus Hale was the latter, though almost no one would have guessed it by looking at him. He had been a mechanical engineer once, and not merely a competent one. His name had appeared in technical journals with a frequency that made colleagues uncomfortable, and inspired the kind of quiet envy that tends to disguise itself as professional skepticism. He had designed systems that outlived the companies that commissioned them, solved problems that teams of 20 could not crack in months, and held patents that generated royalties he rarely thought about. Then, 4 years ago, his wife had died. Margaret, quiet, dark-eyed Margaret, who corrected his grammar and laughed too loudly at her own jokes, had been taken by an illness that moved faster than anyone predicted, and Marcus had walked out of the hospital on a Tuesday afternoon and never returned to the engineering firm where he had worked for 11 years. He simply stopped going. He packed a box of personal items, left his badge on his desk, and did not respond to the messages that followed. His daughter, Claire, was 22 now, studying architecture in Portland, and she called on Sundays and worried about him in the way that children worry about parents who seem to have traded ambition for stillness. He told her he was fine, and the remarkable thing was that he mostly meant it. His ritual was modest. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, he walked 6 blocks to a cafe called Birchwood, sat at the corner table by the bookshelf, ordered a medium black coffee, and read until the lunch crowd arrived. He did not use his phone at the table. He did not work. He simply existed in a way that required almost nothing of the people around him, and the staff at Birchwood had come to appreciate this the way you appreciate a houseplant that asks only for water and returns the favor with something green and living. That Tuesday, he arrived at 8:47, settled into his usual chair, opened a worn copy of a 1960s engineering memoir, and let the morning fold around him like something familiar and warm. He did not notice the woman who came in 12 minutes later, though the staff certainly did. Her name was Vivienne Cole, and she was 36 years old, and she ran the kind of company that appeared on the covers of business magazines and generated the kind of revenue that made economists revise their sector projections. Cole Technology had been her creation from the first line of code, a company built on precision hardware and adaptive infrastructure systems that now supplied technology to hospitals, defense contractors, and municipal governments across 15 states. She was not warm in the way that people use that word casually. She did not smile at strangers or make small talk to smooth over silences. She was, in the precise sense of the term, formidable, not cruel, not unreachable, but possessed of the kind of focus that could make a room feel smaller simply by the direction of her gaze. She wore a deep charcoal blazer over a cream blouse, and her coffee, when it arrived, was an Americano with no sugar, and she held it without drinking it while she reviewed documents on her tablet and waited for her 11 o'clock investor meeting. She had chosen Birchwood because it was close to the building where the meeting was being held, and because she had been told it was quiet. She sat by the window with her back to the room, which was her preference. She did not notice Marcus Hale sitting at the corner table by the bookshelf. She had more important things to notice. The two of them occupied the same room in complete ignorance of each other, separated by 10 feet and about a decade of shared history that neither of them knew they had, and the morning proceeded without incident. until Brandon Mercer walked through the door at 9:15 and brought his damage with him. Brandon Mercer was the kind of man who filled a room the way a dropped glass fills a silence suddenly, unpleasantly, impossible to ignore. He was 44 years old, broad-shouldered, dressed in a blazer that cost more than most people's rent, and he arrived with two companions who laughed at everything he said with the dedicated energy of men who understood that their professional futures depended on the quality of their amusement. He drove a car that he mentioned within the first 5 minutes of any conversation, owned a lakeside property he described as modest, and carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man who had confused the willingness of others to tolerate him with the evidence that he deserved to be tolerated. He had made his money in commercial real estate, and he carried that money like a weapon. He walked to the counter, spoke too loudly, and made a point of sighing at the menu, as though its prices were personally offensive, even as he ordered the most expensive item on it. His companions laughed. The barista, a young woman named Tess, who had been working at Birchwood for 2 years, smiled at him with the practiced blankness of someone who had learned to absorb small unkindnesses without letting them show. Mercer did not notice her smile or her blankness. He was already scanning the room the way certain men scan rooms, not looking for an empty seat but looking for a hierarchy to locate himself within. His eyes moved past the couple near the door, past the two women with laptops, past the older man reading near the window, and landed on Marcus Hale. He stopped looking after that, because Marcus Hale was exactly the kind of man that men like Brandon Mercer needed to find. Marcus sat in his corner in his worn Henley with his old book and his plain coffee, and he was so thoroughly, peacefully unremarkable that Mercer registered him the way a certain kind of person registers anything that appears beneath them, not with anger, not yet, but with a kind of reflexive contempt that required no information to sustain itself. "You see that?" Mercer said quietly to one of his companions, nodding toward Marcus. "I bet he's been nursing that same coffee since 7. His companion smirked. The other one looked away, which was as close to objection as he was willing to come. They found seats at a table not far from Marcus, and the morning began to curdle. Mercer spoke at a volume that suggested he had never been required to consider other people's preference for quiet. He commented on the decor. He made a remark about the neighborhood. He told a story that required him to use the word embarrassing 3 times in reference to someone else's misfortune, and his companions filled in their laughter at the appropriate moments. Marcus turned a page. He did not look up. He had encountered men like Brandon Mercer, before, not this specific man, but this specific flavor of entitlement, and he had learned that the most effective response was to make them irrelevant by refusing to make them real. So he read, and the pencil stayed behind his ear, and his coffee cooled to the temperature he preferred. And he gave Mercer nothing, which was exactly the problem. Men like Mercer had a finely tuned sensitivity to the specific frequency of being disregarded. And Marcus's stillness, his complete, self-contained, utterly genuine indifference was not silence that could be mistaken for fear. It was silence that could only be read as dismissal. And to a man built on the architecture of other people's deference, dismissal was the one wound that could not be walked away from without a response. Men like Mercer did not require a reason to escalate. They required only an absence of surrender, and Marcus's stillness, his complete and unhurried indifference, was the most provocative thing he could have offered. Mercer's voice got slightly louder. He shifted in his chair in Marcus's direction. He made a comment about how some people had nothing better to do on a Tuesday morning, and the comment was aimed at the room but pointed squarely at the corner table. Marcus turned another page. He did this unhurriedly, with the precise motion of someone for whom reading is not a performance of leisure but a genuine act of attention, and the turning of that page in the specific context of Mercer's escalating presence was, in its way, the loudest thing anyone in the room was doing. Mercer stood. He moved toward the counter, but his path, entirely unnecessarily, took him within 2 feet of Marcus's table. His shoulder connected with the back of Marcus's chair, not hard enough to be undeniable, but hard enough to be intentional. Marcus's book shifted. His coffee cup rattled. He looked up, and his expression was calm in the way that very deep water is calm, not because nothing moves beneath it, but because whatever moves there has no need to announce itself. "Watch where you're sitting," Mercer said, without apology, without breaking stride, making it a joke for his companions, who obliged him with laughter. Marcus said nothing. He straightened his cup picked up his book and returned to his page. This was the second wrong thing he did, from Mercer's perspective. The first had been existing without deference. The second was responding to provocation with the absence of reaction. A man like Mercer needed both the offense and the wound, and Marcus was giving him neither. By the time Mercer returned from the counter with a second drink he had not needed, his jaw was set, and his eyes had the particular brightness that signals a decision being made in real time, the decision to make something happen because the alternative, the humiliation of being ignored by a man in a worn gray shirt, was not something his sense of himself could absorb. He bumped the chair again on the way back. Harder this time. Hard enough that the chair legs scraped. Hard enough that the people at the nearest tables looked up. "Hey," Marcus said, and his voice was quiet, without heat. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't do that." Mercer stopped. He turned. His two companions went still in the way that people go still when they sense that a scene is about to become one. "You'd appreciate it," Mercer repeated, rolling the words around in his mouth like something he found amusing. "That's very polite. Very polite from a man who's been sitting in this corner all morning taking up a table with a $3 coffee." He smiled at his companions. They produced their smiles in return, though the second one's was smaller than it had been. "What do you do?" Mercer asked Marcus directly now, as though the question were friendly. "What's your job? Or is this it?" "I'm not going to have this conversation," Marcus said, and turned back to his book. The laugh that came out of Mercer then was the kind that substitutes for argument. He looked around the cafe at Tess behind the counter, at the other customers, inviting them into his contempt, and said, "Louder now. Incredible. Just incredible. Some people have no, and then he did it. Whether it was calculated, or whether it was the last irreversible product of a bad impulse, allowed too much momentum to stop." He stepped forward and shoved Marcus Hale, hard, flat-palmed against his shoulder, and Marcus Hale, who was off balance from having just begun to rise, stumbled sideways and fell directly, entirely, with all the inescapable physics of the thing into the table by the window. The table where Vivian Cole was sitting. The detail registered in the room before it registered in any individual. A shared, collective understanding that arrived faster than thought. Of all the tables, of all the women in the cafe, of all the moments that could have absorbed the momentum of a shove and the physics of a stumble, it had landed here, at this window, against this particular cup of coffee, in front of this particular woman, and the room understood instantly that this was not a small thing. The Americano went across her blazer in a wide, terrible arc. The tablet slid. The documents scattered. The noise was the noise of impact, and of spilled liquid, and of every person in the cafe drawing the same sharp, simultaneous breath. And then the cafe went absolutely, profoundly silent. The kind of silence that is not merely the absence of noise but the presence of collective, held breath. Every customer mid-sentence suddenly wordless. Every barista mid-motion suddenly still. Every cup lowered to its saucer without a sound, as though the room itself had understood that something was happening, and had chosen, unanimously and without instruction, to make space for it. Mercer stood back, with a smirk that was already rehearsing itself into a story. The troublemaker who got what was coming to him, the version he would tell at dinner. His companions did not smirk. They had seen the woman at the window, and they understood, in the way that peripheral people always understand a moment before its center does, that something had gone wrong. Marcus straightened himself. He turned to the woman, and his face held nothing but quiet mortification. The expression of a man who would rather have been anywhere else on earth. "I'm so sorry," he said, and he meant it completely. "I'll pay for the cleaning." "I'm so sorry." Vivian Cole was very still. The Americano had soaked through her blazer and into the blouse beneath, and the documents she had been reviewing were splashed and partially ruined, and her tablet had a smear across its screen. She looked at the man who had fallen into her table, and she did not move, and she did not speak, and the silence stretched. The cafe manager, a compact, efficient man named Gary, was already crossing the floor. A second barista had appeared with cloth napkins. Mercer, seizing the audience that had assembled, spread his hands and said, "Hey, not my fault the guy can't keep his balance." And his voice was still big, still theatrical, and he looked around at the room with the expectation of agreement. Security should probably... Are you hurt? The question did not belong to the scene that everyone in the cafe had been watching. It was the wrong question, too quiet, too direct, too personal, asked of the wrong person by someone who, by every expectation the room had assembled, should have been furious. 3 words, and they rearranged everything. The voice was Vivienne Cole's, and she was not speaking to Mercer. She was speaking to Marcus, not to Mercer, who had expected the weight of her attention the way a man expects a consequence he has earned, not to Gary, who was still moving toward her with the blazer, not to the room, which had arranged itself around a different outcome entirely. She was speaking to the man who had fallen into her table, who was still straightening himself, whose expression had not changed from the quiet mortification it had held since the moment of impact. The cafe was already quiet, but this made it quieter, the specific silence of a room that has revised its expectations midway through an event. Everyone had anticipated the scene playing out in a particular direction. The powerful woman, furious, demanding that the shabby man be removed, the manager apologizing on behalf of the cafe, the bully watching with satisfaction from the edge of the frame. That was the scene. That was how this kind of thing went. Instead, Vivienne Cole was looking at Marcus Hale with an expression that was not anger, and was not pity, and was not the polished neutrality of a person managing a situation. She was looking at him the way someone looks at a thing they recognize from a distance and are not yet certain enough of to name. "I'm fine," Marcus said. "I'm really sorry about your..." He gestured at the Americano spreading across the charcoal blazer, and did not finish the sentence because there was no graceful way to finish it, no word that adequately covered the particular combination of the expensive, the irreplaceable, and the completely accidental. He was already reaching for his wallet. The old instinct of a man who had always preferred to settle his debts in the simplest available currency. "Please sit down," she said quietly. "And you," she added, turning her gaze toward Mercer with a measured deliberateness that made the air in the room feel thinner, "should be quiet." Mercer blinked. The smirk stayed on his face the way a flag stays up after the wind has stopped, technically present, functionally useless. His companions had developed an intense interest in the surface of the table. Vivienne reached across the table and righted the Americano cup, which was empty now. She removed the blazer and handed it to the manager. "Please have it cleaned. Thank you, Gary." And then she turned back to Marcus and looked at his hands. He had placed them flat on the table when he sat, steadying himself from the fall, and the hands told a story. They were not a young man's hands. They were scarred at the knuckles and at the base of the right thumb in the specific way that came from years of working with machinery, from pressure and heat and precision instruments, and the kinds of hours that left permanent marks on the skin. He wore a watch that was not expensive, a slim analog with a scratched crystal that might have been 20 years old, and on the inside of his wrist was a small tattoo she could not quite read from where she was sitting. She had seen those hands before. Or hands enough like them that the memory stirred, surfaced, and would not go back down. "You drop this," she said, picking up his book, which had landed under her table. She glanced at the spine. It was a memoir by an aeronautical engineer from the 1960s. A niche piece of technical history, and something in her expression shifted, so slightly that only someone looking carefully would have noticed it. And Vivienne Cole was, above all things, a person who looked carefully. She set the book in front of him and said, as though it were a question that had nothing to do with cafe spills or loud men in expensive jackets. "You know a lot about structural load systems." Marcus looked at her. "Some," he said. The word was chosen with the care of someone who had spent enough years around precise language to know that understatement, used correctly, was not modesty, but accuracy. He did not know everything about structural load systems. He knew what he had worked on, and he knew it well, and some was the honest perimeter of that knowledge, which still happened to be considerably more than most people in any room he had ever occupied. More than some, I think. She said this without making it an accusation. It was an observation, delivered in the tone of someone who has spent years listening to the precise weight of what people say and what they leave out, and had become quite skilled at reading the gap between the two. Marcus's answer had been correct and modest in equal measure, and the combination was unusual enough to make her pause. The quiet between them was different from the silence of the room. It was conversational, even. He did not ask why she was asking. She did not explain why she had. "There's a pencil behind your ear," she said, and the observation sounded like the beginning of something. He reached up and touched it, an automatic gesture, confirmation rather than surprise. Old habit. Engineers have old habits, she said, and then she said nothing else. And the small space between the observation and the silence it produced was exactly the right size for Marcus to understand that she was not making small talk. She was working quietly, methodically, the way she did everything toward a conclusion she had not yet named. Mercer, from across the room, had recomposed himself enough to laugh a short, disbelieving sound. "Lady, I don't know what you think you're I asked you to be quiet," Vivienne said, without turning her head. She had a particular skill developed not through effort but through long practice of addressing a person without giving them her eyes, and the effect of it was that the person being addressed felt simultaneously seen and reduced, which was a precise and specific kind of power that Mercer had never encountered before and did not know what to do with. He was quiet. The word had landed on him differently than he was used to words landing, not as a request, not as a negotiation, but as a fact being stated about the immediate future, and something in the way she said it had communicated, without elaboration, that the future she was describing had very little room for him in it if he chose not to comply. He complied. Gary, the manager, stood at a respectful distance with the blazer folded over his arm. The room had not returned to its previous noise level. It was holding its breath. Vivienne picked up her phone and sent a text in 3 words. Then she folded her hands on the table, looked at Marcus, and said, "Tell me about your work." He studied her face for a moment. "I'm not working. Not currently." There was no apology in the statement, no defensiveness. He said it with the same equanimity with which he might have said that it was Tuesday, or that the coffee was cold. It was a fact about his life, accurately reported, and he had been reporting it long enough that it no longer required either justification or regret. "What were you working on?" "Before." She asked this without preamble, without establishing why she was asking, or what she intended to do with the answer. She simply asked it. The way someone asks a question that has been waiting a long time to be asked, and let the silence after it do its work. He turned the book over once in his hands, the old thinking gesture, and then he said, without elaboration, without emphasis, "Structural dynamic systems. Load-bearing optimization. Some materials work." He paused. "Patent applications," at one point. Years ago, the door to the cafe opened and a young man entered quickly, slightly breathless, holding a tablet. He was early 30s, well-dressed, and his eyes went directly to Vivienne with the look of someone who had been summoned and was not sure what for. She held up one finger without looking at him. He stopped where he was and waited. "Patent applications," Vivienne repeated. She asked this very carefully. The way a person asks a question they already know the answer to, but need to hear said aloud. In this room, by this person, so that the thing can be real in a way it has not been real until now. Infrastructure systems. Some proprietary compression technology. He said it the way you say something that is true but no longer particularly relevant to your life. It was a long time ago. For whom? The question was so direct, so stripped of social cushioning, that it landed with more weight than she probably intended. But that was how Vivienne Cole asked questions without the softening that people sometimes added to make the interrogation feel like conversation. She asked them like someone who already suspected the answer and needed only the confirmation. He named the licensing firm, a small technical intermediary that most people in the industry would not have recognized. Vivienne Cole recognized it. The color of her attention, already sharp, became sharper. She kept her face entirely neutral. She had spent 15 years keeping her face neutral in rooms where showing what she was thinking would have cost her something. "Excuse me for just a moment," she said, and turned to her assistant, and she said 2 sentences to him very quietly. He looked down at his tablet. His expression changed. He looked up at Marcus. He looked back down at his tablet. He looked at Vivienne with the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he was not expecting to confirm, and he said, in a voice reduced almost to nothing, "It's him." Vivienne turned back to Marcus. "There's a name I've been trying to locate for almost 3 years, she said. A name attached to a series of patents that were licensed to Cole Technology in 2017. Patents that," she paused, choosing the exact right word, "saved the company." She let that sit for a moment. The person who held those patents sold them and disappeared. No forwarding address, no professional profile, no indication of where he went or why. Her eyes did not waver from his face. I looked for a long time. Across the room, Mercer had gone very still. The theatrical confidence had drained from his posture so gradually that it was hard to say precisely when it had left. His companions had not spoken in several minutes. Marcus said nothing. He had the expression of a man who has been found in a room he thought was empty and is deciding how to feel about it. The name on the patents, Vivienne said, is M. Hale. She let the letters exist in the air of the room without immediately explaining what they meant or why she was saying them here. At a window table in a cafe, to a man in a gray Henley who had just been shoved into her coffee. She had spent 3 years looking for that name attached to a face, and now the face was sitting across from her, and she was taking the particular care of someone who has been waiting long enough to know that rushing the moment would be a waste of it. The cafe was not quiet anymore in the way it had been quiet a moment ago now. It was quiet in the way of a held breath, of a room that has understood something and does not yet know what to do with the understanding. Marcus Hale, Vivienne said. And the name, spoken that way, sounded like a statement of record, like something being entered into evidence. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Those patents went a long time ago. I didn't track what happened to them." "I know," she said, "but I did. The adaptive load balancing system in our infrastructure network, the one that processes 340 million data exchanges per day across 11 municipal grids, runs on your framework. Not a version of it. Not an interpretation of it. Your framework. Precisely." She paused. "In 2018, when our main architecture collapsed under scale stress that our engineers did not anticipate, your system is the reason we did not lose everything. Your system is the reason coal technology still exists." She paused again. "And I never got to say that to you." Mercer's assistant, the second companion, the one who had looked away during the shoving, stood up very quietly and walked to the door and left. The first companion looked at Mercer. Mercer looked at nothing. Gary, the manager, had stopped trying to appear professionally neutral. He was standing with the blazer folded over his arms, looking at Marcus Hale with the expression of a man rapidly revising a mental category. "Prove it," Mercer said, from across the room. His voice had lost its volume. It had not lost its edge, but the edge was now attached to nothing solid. "Show me. Show all of us, because this feels like..." Vivienne turned her head toward her assistant, who turned the tablet to face the room. On the screen, a patent record, a name, a photograph that was unmistakably Marcus Hale, a decade younger. Below that, a licensing agreement. Below that, a technical schematic that anyone in the engineering field would have recognized as significant. The assistant scrolled. Patent application numbers. Filing dates in 2016 and 2017. A corporate acquisition record. And then, because Vivienne Cole was thorough in all things, her assistant expanded a second document: internal correspondence from Cole Technologies' engineering team in 2018, the crisis year, the year the architecture had failed. The subject line was still visible. Hale Framework, Emergency Deployment Authorization. The date was a Tuesday in October. The authorization signature at the bottom was Vivienne's own. "It's not a performance," Vivienne said to the room, not to Mercer specifically. "It's a record." She said this with the same even, undecorated delivery she used for all factual statements, because she had found over the years that facts stated plainly without emphasis, without drama, without the inflection of someone trying to win an argument, were the most difficult things in a room to argue with. The record existed. The name was on it. The dates were on it. The technical specifications were on it. These were not things that changed depending on how loudly someone spoke. Tess, behind the counter, had both hands over her mouth. The couple near the door had their phones out. Gary was not pretending to have anything to do. Mercer looked at his companion, who was not looking back. He looked at the tablet. He looked at Marcus Hale sitting in the corner with his old book and his cold coffee, and his scarred hands, and something in his face shifted, not remorse, not yet, but the animal recognition of a man who has cornered something that turned out to be larger than him. "I didn't know," he started. The sentence did not know how to finish itself. It had begun as a defense and arrived somewhere that had no architecture to stand on, because the defense itself was the problem, not that he hadn't known, but that his not knowing had been so complete, so deliberately uncurious, so confident in its own sufficiency. He had not needed to know. That had always been the point. And now, the point had collapsed beneath him. And the rubble was his. No, Vivian said. You didn't. That's the point. She let the observation exist without decoration, without the editorializing that a lesser version of herself might have added. She did not explain what the point was. She did not need to. Every person in the room understood it. Not that Marcus Hale was important because of what he had built, but that the impulse to diminish a person on the basis of their clothing and their coffee and the quiet way they occupied a chair was a failure that operated entirely without the information it would need to defend itself. She stood. She straightened the blouse that was still damp from the spilled Americano, and she walked across the room to where Marcus was sitting, and she did something that made the room hold even tighter to its silence. She picked up the cloth napkin from the table beside him, and, with the precise and deliberate care of someone making a public statement with a private gesture, she blotted the faint splash of coffee from his sleeve. He looked at her. She looked back. In the window behind her, the city moved in its ordinary, indifferent way. A bus passing. A woman with a stroller. A man checking his phone without breaking stride. And none of it touched the specific gravity of the 10 seconds in which Marcus Hale and Vivian Cole held each other's gaze across a table that had, 20 minutes ago, been covered in spilled coffee and scattered documents, and was now the quietest place in the room. If not for what you built, she said quietly, so that only he could hear her and the people nearest the table, I would not be standing in this room. I would not have a company. 314 people who work for me would not have their jobs. 7 municipal contracts that provide infrastructure to hospitals and fire departments and emergency services would not be operational. She folded the napkin. I owe you more than a coffee. The first investor, a gray-haired man in a dark suit, who had been seated on the far side of the room for the past 20 minutes, waiting for his 11 o'clock meeting, watching all of it, stood up and straightened his jacket. He walked to the center of the room, which required a certain amount of personal commitment, and looked at Mercer. I think, he said, with the considered delivery of a man who bills by the hour, that we're going to have to revisit the terms of our conversation today. We have a policy about the character of our partners and the way they conduct themselves. He glanced at Marcus, and I'll add that anyone who doesn't recognize Marcus Hale's work has not been reading the right journals. Mercer opened his mouth. He had spent 40 years filling silences, with the particular confidence of a man who believed his words had weight because people had always, eventually, responded to them. But the silence in the cafe now was not the kind that waited to be filled. It was the kind that had already been decided. And he was standing at the wrong end of the decision. And for once in his life, the words did not come. Don't, his companion said, quietly, finally, from beside him. And for once, Mercer listened. The companion who had spent the better part of the morning laughing at the right moments and averting his eyes at others, had finally reached a threshold he was not willing to cross, and the single word he had withheld all morning arrived now with more weight than everything else that had been said in the room combined. He meant, don't make this worse. He meant, you have already lost this. He meant, sometimes the only remaining form of dignity is the ability to stop. The collapse, when it came, was not explosive. It did not need to be. Mercer stood in the center of the cafe, with the deal he had driven 40 minutes across the city to close dissolving in the air around him, and the expression on his face cycled through outrage and calculation, and a kind of naked bewilderment before settling into something that resembled, distantly, the beginning of shame. He straightened his jacket. He put cash on the table, more than was necessary, in the way people sometimes do when money is the only currency they know how to spend. He looked at Marcus once more. I didn't know who you were, he said. The words were an explanation, and an apology, and a plea all compressed into 7 syllables, and they arrived with the particular desperation of a man who has just realized that the story he was telling himself about who mattered and who didn't, about how the world was ordered and where he sat within it, has turned out to be exactly as flimsy as the people he had spent years dismissing. Marcus looked up from the table. His expression was not unkind, but it was not warm either. It was simply clear. The way still water is clear, you could see straight to the bottom, and the bottom held no comfort for the person looking. That's the thing, Marcus said. It shouldn't matter. He said it without heat, without the triumphant edge that the line might have carried in a lesser man's mouth. He said it the way he said most true things plainly, with the unhurried certainty of someone who has arrived at it through experience rather than argument, through years of watching what happened when people organized their respect around status, and what was left behind when the status changed. Mercer had no answer for that. He left. His companion followed, 2 steps behind, without looking at anyone. The door swung closed behind them, and the cafe exhaled. The investor, his name was Frederick Oakes, and he had been in the business of separating good decisions from bad ones for 31 years, pulled a chair to the table where Marcus was sitting and looked at Vivienne. "You can do the introduction properly now," he said. Frederick Oakes had the particular composure of a man who had witnessed many rooms change direction and had developed the habit of adjusting his position before the change completed itself rather than after. He said this without irony, without the smugness that lesser observers might have brought to the moment. He simply noted, accurately and with good timing, that the circumstances of the meeting had evolved beyond their original parameters. Vivienne Cole looked at Marcus Hale, and for the first time since she had walked into Birchwood that morning, something in her expression moved toward what a careful observer might have called warmth. "This is Marcus Hale," she said. "He is the reason Cole Technology exists." She said it the way she would have said it in a boardroom, in a quarterly review, in a shareholder statement, with the clear, level conviction of a person making an accurate attribution and standing fully behind it, not as sentiment, not as gratitude in performance, as fact. As the kind of sentence that belonged in the historical record of a company, because it was, by any measure, true. Marcus held his coffee cup with both hands, the way he always did when it had gone slightly cold. "Former engineer," he said. "Currently retired." "I know," Vivienne said. "I'd like to talk about that." She said it the way she said most things that mattered, without preamble, without the softening of suggestion. But without pressure either. It was simply an opening, stated plainly. Left at the threshold, and not pushed through. What he did with it was his. She had learned, over the course of building a company from nothing, that the most capable people rarely needed to be pushed. They needed to be given a door that was genuinely open, and then trusted with it. The rest of the morning was not what any of them had planned. The investor meeting happened, but it happened differently than it had been scheduled, not in the conference room 2 blocks away, but at the window table at Birchwood, with 3 cups of fresh coffee, and Marcus Hale sitting at the corner of the conversation, the way a structural beam sits at the corner of a room, quietly essential. He did not talk much. When he did, what he said was precise and uncommon, in the specific way that made Frederick Oakes go still and make notes on a folded receipt. Vivienne watched Marcus the way she had watched very few people in her life, with the full beam of her attention, undivided and genuine, the kind of attention she usually reserved for problems she could not immediately solve. He was not a problem. He was something else. She could not quite name it yet. Gary brought fresh coffee without being asked. Tess had quietly cleaned the spill from the floor and rearranged the window table, without disturbing any of the 3 people sitting at it. The other customers in the cafe had returned to their conversations and their laptops and their books, but with the slightly elevated alertness of people who have witnessed something and are not quite ready to let it become ordinary. It was past noon when they finally stood. Frederick Oakes shook Marcus's hand for slightly longer than was usual, and said something about hoping to have the pleasure of his consultation in the future. And Marcus said he would think about it, and he meant that exactly he would think about it, not commit to it, not promise it, just think about it. And Frederick Oakes seemed to understand that this was as much as he was going to get, and that it was, for the moment, enough. Vivienne and Marcus stood at the door for a moment longer. Outside, the city moved in its ordinary way. Inside, the cafe had begun to return to its own rhythms, the hiss of the espresso machine, the low hum of conversation resuming, the gentle percussion of cups on saucers. But the window table still held something, some residual charge of everything that had happened there, and neither of them was quite ready to step all the way out of it. They stood at the threshold, which is where the most important conversations always seem to briefly stop, and the afternoon waited for them without urgency. "Dinner," she said. It was not quite a question. It was also not quite a request. It occupied that precise middle territory where Vivienne Cole was most comfortable, the territory of a thing she had decided she wanted, offered in a form that left the other person the dignity of a response. He considered this. He was a man who considered things not out of reluctance, but out of the same precision that had once made him exceptional at his work. He considered things the way he had once considered load distributions, not looking for the path of least resistance, but for the configuration that could hold weight over time. Dinner, he agreed. One word. He had always believed that the length of a commitment had nothing to do with the words used to make it. And this one, short, unhurried, preceded by the specific silence of a man who had weighed a thing properly, felt more settled than most. They walked out of the cafe into the afternoon. The city was doing what cities do, its noise, and its motion, and its 10,000 simultaneous indifferent dramas, and the two of them moved into it without ceremony. The distance between a powerful CEO and a quiet man in a worn gray shirt looked, from a certain angle, like no distance at all. Inside Birchwood, Gary stood by the window table with a small laminated card in his hand. He had made it that morning, meant as a reminder for himself and his staff about a difficult customer from the previous week. And now it seemed to mean something different and more. He placed it on the stand at the center of the window table, adjusted it until it sat level, and stepped back. It read, "Respect everyone. You never know who is sitting beside you." Tess, wiping down the counter, read it from across the room. She thought about the man in the gray Henley and his old book, and the way he had said, without heat and without performance, that respect shouldn't depend on position. She thought about how long she had been standing behind the counter, absorbing small unkindnesses and returning practiced blankness, and how little that exchange had cost her, and how long it had compounded. The afternoon rush began. People filed in and out, ordered their drinks, chose their seats, and became for a few minutes adjacent to strangers who would never know them. The window table filled with a different couple, who did not notice the small card and would not remember the chair they were sitting in. The corner table, where Marcus Hale had spent hundreds of mornings reading in his unhurried way, waited for Thursday. The pencil marks in the margins of old books waited for nothing. They were already what they needed to be. There is a kind of power that announces itself, and a kind of power that does not. The kind that announces itself requires an audience. It feeds on recognition, expands into attention, collapses without applause. The kind that does not announce itself is different. It sits at a corner table. It wears old clothes. It answers direct questions with precise, unhurried words, and returns to its book when the conversation is done. It does not need to be recognized to remain what it is, but when it is recognized by someone with the clarity to see it, the recognition changes the room entirely. Marcus Hale had not walked into Birchwood that Tuesday expecting anything. He had not walked out of it expecting anything either. Not in the way that expectation usually means. What he carried out was not a job offer or a title or a returned status. It was something smaller and more durable. A conversation that had been overdue for years, with someone who had looked for him long enough to find him in a corner of the city where he had gone specifically not to be found. It was the knowledge that the work he had done quietly, done without acknowledgement, done in the years when he still believed that the right problem was worth all the time it required, had held 314 jobs, had held 7 municipal contracts, had held, on a Tuesday in October, in 2018, a company that had been hours from collapse. The work had held. That was enough. That had always been enough. The rest, the dinner, the tentative conversation about what came next, the cautious arithmetic of two very different people calculating whether proximity might become something was not guaranteed. But it was real, which is something, and Brandon Mercer drove back across the city alone, in his expensive car, with the memory of what had happened sitting beside him in the passenger seat, like a thing he could not put down, and the question he kept not being able to answer was not how he had failed to know who Marcus Hale was, but how he had become so certain, for so long, that it mattered.